I definitely want to thank everyone for joining us this evening. My name is Sandra Azocar, and I'm the Executive Director of Friends of Medicare, an advocacy organization that has for the last 40 years promoted the protection and expansion over public health care here in Alberta, and with the work that we do with the Canadian Health Coalition across the country as well. We're very excited to be able to host this webinar. We have participated in quite a few in the past few months, and so this is our second webinar, and as you can see, we're having a bit of difficulties with the technology, but hopefully our other panelists will be able to join us. I really wanted to let you know that what we will do, the format of this webinar will be that our panelists will do a presentation and we will have as much time as possible for you to engage with questions around this issue, and it's a way for you to participate and to get all your answers given to you, or at least you can be directed as to where you can look for more answers if that's what you wish. I want to thank our panelists this evening. They are incredible people in this area. Their vast experience and research and knowledge regarding blood, non-remunerated blood is incredible, and we're very fortunate to have been able to get them to talk to us about a very present risk that we currently are facing in our province once again. And I just want to set the stage a little bit. On July the 8th, 2020, MLA Tanny Yao introduced Bill 204, which is called the Voluntary Blood Donation Repeal Act. And this very work-shy, mere 3-page bill simply calls for the repeal of the Voluntary Blood Donation Act that was passed in Alberta on March of 2017. And it was Bill 3. Bill 3 was the Voluntary Blood Donation Act, which was put into place to protect and enshrine blood and plasma as public resources under law, and to prohibit them from being treated as a market-based commodity. Bill 204 offers no alternative to address our current dependency on US plasma-derived products, and no reason whatsoever for this government to necessitate the need for this repeal, except to further this government's never-ending quest to privatize our public resource, being blood in this case. If Bill 204 is passed, it will put our public blood authority, Canadian Blood Services, in a position in which it will need to compete with private companies, creating a competitive market for Canadian blood products. This is an extremely lucrative business, the plasma market, and it has been projected that by 2026 it will reach about a 38.65 billion reach. And so we know that this is exactly where this government has always talked about opening Alberta for business. Today in the Private Members Committee, MLA Yao indicated that they needed this bill because companies won't come here unless if they can't access the product being plasma. Our panelists are going to talk a lot more about the differences between plasma and plasma-derived products, and I think it's really good. There's a need for us to understand the difference and for us to be able to make an informed decision as to this upcoming bill. So I'll let you know exactly where they was at today at the Private Members Bill Committee. They basically tabled it to next Monday at 9 a.m., where they will be bringing both sides, the government and the official opposition will be bringing in stakeholders to talk to this bill. And at that point, the committee will need to decide whether or not this bill deserves a robust debate in legislation in the legislature, or it will recommend that it dies on the order paper. Again, we haven't seen, it's been rare that we have seen government bills actually die in the order paper. So it is our hope that that if this bill will take too long prior to the legislature's getting up for the summer, that it might be reintroduced in the fall, giving us a bit of time to kind of push this government to take the necessary action to reconsider perhaps this bill. I don't want to take too much of the time while we wait for Michelle, but I want to introduce, before I actually introduce our panelists, I want to let you know that there's a question and answer icon at the bottom of your screen. And if you have a pressing question that you want to write down before you forget it, please just put it in there, and we will make sure that it gets answered. We will also be sharing this webinar online after it's done, or any other documentation that our panelists may want to share with you. So look to that. We will have that on our website as well as on our Facebook page. But we encourage you to ask as many questions as possible. And I am now going to introduce our first panelist, Kat Lanteigne, and warrior extraordinaire. She is the executive director and co-founder of bloodwatch.org. Kat is a Toronto-based writer, actor, and Save Blood advocate. Her play Tainted, which tells the story of how the tainted blood crisis impacted Canadian families, premiered in 2013. Kat was the lead advocate who successfully petitioned the Ontario government to ban private paid plasma clinics opening, and subsequently toured her play to support the legislation in plasma clinics.
Thank you.
Hi, Michelle. In December of 2014, the Voluntary Blood Donation Act was passed in a unanimous vote in Ontario. The tainted blood crisis and the Creever inquiry have been at the center of her life's work as an artist. She's proud to be the co-founder of bloodwatch.org as a continuation of this work. And Kat has, for the longest time, been going cross-country to stop private plasma clinics from gaining a foothold in order to safeguard the integrity of Canada's blood system. So, like I said, she's a tireless warrior in this area. Thank you for coming, Michelle. I was just telling people and setting the stage a little bit as to where we are at currently with Bill 204, and while we waited for you. So I don't know if you want Michelle or Kat to go first. It's up to you guys.
Michelle, please.
Michelle? Okay, well, so then I will introduce Michelle now then. Michelle, again, we're very, very fortunate to have her. Michelle is a fountain of knowledge in this area. Dr. Michele Brill-Edwards is a pediatrician and the Canadian Health Coalition longstanding board member responsible for blood and plasma issues. Most recently, Dr. Brill-Edwards testified in support of maintaining voluntary donation of both blood and plasma in Canada during the Senate hearings on Bill S-252 to ban payment for plasma in Canada. Dr. Brill-Edwards has unique expertise in Canadian drug regulatory science, medicine, and law. As Canada's former senior physician responsible for the regulation of clinical trials and market approvals of prescription medicines in Canada. Following her resignation in 1996 to blow the whistle on Health Canada's safety lapses, Dr. Brill-Edwards has provided pro bono expertise to organizations that protect whistleblowers and promote the regulation of medicines in the public interest. She advised blood-injured groups extensively throughout the Creever inquiry years, explaining the regulatory negligence of Health Canada and the Canadian Red Cross in causing Canada's tainted blood catastrophe. She has recently retired from clinical practice and teaching in pediatric emergency medicine at the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario in Ottawa. So we're very, very fortunate to have her here today. And now I leave the floor to you, Dr. Edwards.
Thanks very much, Sandra. Yeah, please let me know if you have trouble hearing me. And thank you for the introduction and the opportunity to participate. It's a very important issue. The question I think that we're trying to resolve at the moment in Alberta is whether or not privatizing the collection of plasma in Alberta is in any way helpful to either I thought it might be good to just begin with a brief explanation of the nature of blood and plasma in order to distinguish the two materials and to understand that there are two ways of collecting plasma. So the first issue is blood, and of course we all know that's the red stuff that you see when you cut yourself or have a nosebleed, and it contains a liquid component called plasma and cellular components called red cells, platelets, white cells, a whole array of different cellular elements that float in the plasma when blood is circulating in your body. The are important. Red cells are used to replace blood usually in the hospital in circumstances where patients have lost blood, for example, through sorry, are you asking a question?
Yeah, no, Dr. Brill-Edwards, I think when you move around, your mic moves around and might lose you a little bit.
So I should stay still.
Yes.
Okay, good. Anyway, going back to the basic elements and their uses. Red cells, as I was mentioning, bring oxygen to the body, and they're used in a hospital to replace blood, for example, at surgery or during trauma and hemorrhage. Platelets, similarly, are clotting activists, if you will, used in hospital to replace platelets for patients who are deficient, for example, cancer patients. And plasma itself is used as well. In its full form in a hospital, for example, for burn patients who are losing entire elements of plasma. But there's another use of plasma from blood that is unusual and requires vast amounts of plasma to be collected. And that's the use of the proteins, the multiple proteins that are contained in plasma. There's over 20 of these that are therapeutically useful proteins, but they need to be separated out into individual products. And that happens through the process of manufacturing called fractionation. Excuse me. That's a process that is different from the traditional collection of blood. So blood collection, as we understand it, the traditional method, collects whole blood and separates it into the liquid plasma and the components, and all of those get used primarily in hospital. But the collection of vast amounts of plasma occurs through a different process called plasmapheresis, and that is an industrial well, actually, it's the beginning of an industrial process called fractionation. So the same initial steps are taken. A person comes into, the collection center and fills out a questionnaire to have their risk factors assessed by questioning their lifestyle. Then blood is tested for the known agents that we are worried about, like germs like HIV and hepatitis. And then a needle is put in the arm and whole blood is taken off. But then a key thing happens with the plasmapheresis process. The blood is separated into plasma and the solid components. And then the red cells, platelets, and all solid components are sent back into the body. So when the person is leaving the collection center, they have all those good things reinserted into their bodies, and they've only left behind some plasma, and plasma is very easily generated or regenerated within a day or so by the body. And that allows this different collection system to generate vast quantities of plasma that can be used on an industrial scale. So we have literally tens of thousands of collections joined, pooled into these large vats. The industrial process is different from the unit by unit collection that you have for traditional blood collection, because it allows us to take an extra safety measure. And that is the inactivation of that huge vat of collected plasma that can be subject to very harsh processes like heat and chemicals, solvent detergents, filtration. These are things that will inactivate HIV and hepatitis and all the other known germs that we know about. It cannot be done to the fragile cellular components, the red cells, platelets, white cells. And so that is the fundamental differentiation in why we allow, at times, payment for plasma in some jurisdictions and don't allow, in any jurisdiction, in a developed country anyway, payment for blood. So all blood collection is voluntary, let's say, and payment for plasma is allowed in some jurisdictions, primarily the US and one or two European countries, because originally, historically, when fractionation first became widely available, it was believed that these inactivation procedures would work for everything. We learned during the scandals of HIV and hepatitis contamination of the blood and plasma supplies that that wasn't true, that when we're dealing with a new unknown pathogen that we can't test blood for and we can't inactivate when it gets into these large vats, we are in trouble. So it's for that reason that in many countries, including Canada until recently, we have always held the position that plasma should not be paid for in collection, just as blood is not paid for when collected. So I just set that out so that people can understand the discussion tonight, because the real arguments are premised on people understanding those sort of very complicated principles. I'll just take a moment to review the position of the Canadian Health Coalition, which I represent here. There's a couple of principles that we regard as fundamental to Canada's national interests. The first is that Canada must safeguard its secure, sufficient supply of blood as an essential national health resource. And the good news is we today have a robust tradition of voluntary donation of blood that allows us to say we are fully self-sufficient for the day-to-day needs of blood and blood components in Canada. The problem we're facing and what we're debating tonight is that to initiate payment of plasma in one of Canada's largest provinces is a threat to our ability to sustain that self-sufficiency in blood. So payment for plasma is a threat to sustaining the blood supply. I can go through with you a little bit about the reasons why, but it's well established now that when you introduce a paid system and voluntary donors of blood are drawn to a paid system for plasma, it is almost impossible to ever get those persons to return to the voluntary system. In Europe, it's shown that at very best, if you try hard, you can get 1 out of 5 lost donors to return to the voluntary system. And that's even if the paid system disappears. is we allow this change, paying for plasma in a large province of Alberta, to take hold, we are risking an irreversible loss of voluntary donors to the blood system. Then the second principle is that also for plasma, we should be regarding a safe, sufficient supply of plasma as an essential national resource. At this point, we don't have that. We collect not enough plasma to meet our needs for plasma products. We do collect enough to meet the needs for straight plasma in hospital, but we don't collect anywhere near enough to meet the need of the manufactured pharmaceutical protein products derived from plasma in the industrial processes. So how do we get there? That's the issue. We need to build a supply sufficient eventually for all our needs, but at least at a minimum, we need enough to sustain us during times of crisis shortage of the plasma products that are derived almost exclusively from the huge American system that supplies about 70% of the entire world supply. We know that we face at least two threats that could cause such a shortage. The first being national security, with the president of the US showing us recently, repeatedly, that he is prepared to sequester products that he deems essential to the health of Americans. And if he sequesters plasma, then the rest of the world is in big trouble. Similarly, if we run into the unfortunate advent of a new pathogen, then again, the system cannot sustain a situation where the American supply is contaminated and not available to us. We need enough plasma then to help us through those eventualities. I should mention that regarding safety, a new unknown pathogen called the chronic wasting disease prion is on our doorstep, and we could talk about that again later, but that is a real safety threat that is knocking at the door. So what amount do we need to be sufficient if such a huge crisis occurs? The answer is roughly about 50% of the plasma and plasma products that we use should be provided through Canadian voluntary donation if we are to survive those crisis situations. The good news is we are already on the way to achieving that. We've gone from the order of 13% a few years ago, now into the 20% mark, and we're on our way to full 50% sufficiency. CBS, the Canadian Blood Services, is on track to open 3 new voluntary plasma collection centers in Canada, over and above the half dozen or so that exist now. And those are going to be next month in Sudbury, end of the year in Lethbridge, and mid next year in Kelowna. So it is a mistake now at this point when we are underway in our collection of voluntary plasma to adopt a paid plasma system that imperils our blood system and competes with our new efforts to increase the collection of voluntary plasma in Canada. I think I'll stop there. I've probably taken too much time already, but thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Brill-Edwards. Like I said, if you guys have any questions as presenters are going through their presentation, please put them into the question and answer icon, and we'll try and get as many questions answered before the end of this panel webinar. And now our next speaker is Kat Lanteigne. Thank you, Kat.
Okay.
It says,
There
Go
we go.
ahead.
you can hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh,
Thank.
great. Thank you so much for having me. I think that I'm just going to start with what is the benefit to repeal this bill, which is what is currently in front of the legislators right now in Alberta, and Alberta, you know, the citizens and residents of Alberta. What does repealing this bill get Alberta? What does it do? What is the result? The result of repealing this bill would mean that Alberta would now have an export business of plasma. So they would have a private collector who would then be permitted to pay people in Alberta to sell their plasma, which the company then takes and sells on the international market to a fractionator. And then that fractionator, which is essentially like a biotech company that makes these plasma drugs, takes it and they essentially do whatever they want with it. They make it into whatever drug that they're making at the time, and then they then take those drugs and then try to get into the tender process around the world to sell those drugs back to the people that run blood services around the world. So that's really important to have that kind of clarity on the repealing of this bill, because that's what it would do. So if the goal of the Alberta government is to support the depletion of the plasma supply in Alberta and to sell the sovereignty of donors in Alberta to foreign companies, then that's what that bill would achieve. The bill does not achieve plasma security or our security of supply in any way, shape, or form. It does not do that. The company has been operating in Saskatchewan since January of 2016, and in Moncton now since 2017, and not a drop of plasma has ever helped a Canadian patient. It is all for the export market. And that particular company sells to a German fractionator, which was bought by a Chinese investment firm. So essentially what this would do was sell the sovereignty of your plasma donations that would, or the people that are selling their plasma out of Alberta. It would be owned by a group of investors from China. So just to make the business deal about what's actually happening with the pharmaceutical industry that is trying to essentially do a large-scale takeover to control our plasma supply chain. Now, we've been very fortunate that Bloodwatch has worked very hard, and we were able to have a seat at the table at the EU Commission last year. We were one of the only 2 Canadian delegates. Canadian Blood Services was the other delegate. And at that commission, it was very clear that all the EU member states do not want the private commercial paid plasma operators to proliferate anymore in Europe because they can't control their supply chain, which means they can't secure the supply chain. So in Europe, they actually call blood and plasma a strategic resource, meaning that it's so important to the health and safety of the people of their countries that it can't just be used as a market commodity that's sort of bought and sold to the whim of the market. Because there's a big difference between, with the supply and demand argument, there's a difference between a demand and a need. And so what happens often is that these pharmaceutical companies, they push on the demand for the product instead of, and that pressure comes from the outside. A lot of that pressure comes from the outside. So the other issue with the bill that the commercial private industry doesn't like, and the real reason why they want it repealed, is because in these Voluntary Blood Donations Act, blood and plasma has a designation in the bill as a public resource. So when you have that kind of designation in a law, it means that it is there to be used for the good. It's a public good to be used for the good of the people. And that's what they don't want, because if that is repealed, they can then just source whatever they want, how much they want, because that's, they're just going to sort of pull the pin and let them collect. And that's why it's really important in our view for this bill not to be repealed, because without that protection, we can't protect the domestic blood supply in Alberta. And Alberta, because we have a national blood system and Alberta donors donate, voluntarily at such high levels, Alberta actually helps BC patients with 10 to 15% of their whole blood. So anything that one province does actually impacts another province. And that's really critical to understand, that it's not just broken up into provinces. We're actually all interlinked on this issue as a country. And so that's really important to understand, that this bill, if it is repealed, it does not benefit any patients. That's a fallacy that the private paid commercial industry that does work with some patient groups tries to essentially scare people to say, if you don't let us in and take that plasma, people aren't going to get their medicine. And that is fundamentally false, because another thing that's really important to address, and we are not suggesting that we support payment, but under the current legislation, payment for plasma is actually not banned. That's not true, because Canadian Blood Services and their special circumstances that make exemptions for some kind of remuneration if it was needed. However, so that issue of saying that, oh, this is about payment and just let people pay them, it isn't what we're actually arguing right now. This literally is about protecting our donor base. The difference is, in the United States, even though the paid plasma industry is, it's immoral, it's predatory. It collects from the poorest and the most vulnerable populations throughout the United States. That's very well documented from official studies and from numerous, journalistic exposés that have been done over the past 8 years. But the US is self-sufficient. And the US has a major voluntary system throughout the US and states across America. And so they have this ability to have an export business. Canada does not. We don't have the kind of population, and we don't have the capacity right now, because we have not been able to take care of our patients first. So what we're arguing is we have to get to that 50% mark and not diminish the public system to make sure we secure that supply for it's about 10,500 patients that absolutely have to have that plasma product or they die. That is a high level risk assessment that's been done by Canadian Blood Services, and that's been done by blood operators around the world. So it's extremely concerning to us, because this is nothing more than a big pharma lobby that is sort of selling the snake oil to governments to try to say, hey, let us in, we'll take care of this for you. It'll all be cheaper once we get down, because we can, collect faster than anybody else can. And people won't donate unless they're paid. And that is completely factually untrue. France was able to get to 50% self-sufficiency within 4 years, under 4 years, when they ramped up and they put out their plasma collection system. New Zealand is almost entirely self-sufficient. Australia is already at a 50% capacity as well. They're working towards 70%. The Netherlands is at 70%. Italy is almost entirely self-sufficient, and Belgium is on its way. So what's been proven is that when countries implement a national plasma strategy and they ask and they inform the public that that's needed, it works. So it's really it's a trick. It's essentially like a business trick that they try to use these scare tactics to say, if we don't come in, you're not going to get your medicine. or we're going to solve your problem. But they actually don't solve our problem, because these private collectors, they make their money brokering this plasma out on the international market. And so there's no argument, why would we lose out on our investment, because CBS is already funded through all of the provinces and their plasma strategy has been approved and funded. Why would we do anything to undermine that achievement? Just to close, we also want to make it really clear that this is not the time during a pandemic to sell out our donor base to private commercial companies. We need our donors to be motivated and mobilized through our National Blood Authority across the country, and we need to secure our supply chain right now. So we would suggest that this issue is something, if the government really wants to revisit it, that we revisit this after we are at least 50% self-sufficient and we know our patients in Canada are taken care of.
Thank you very much, Kat, and thank you again, Dr. Brill-Edwards, for both of your presentations. We have quite a few questions coming in, so I'm just going to start out by reading one of the first ones. And it asks, and this is something that we heard at committee level today too, that MLA Yao is actually doing this and pushing this because he has heard from so many patient groups that this is something that they need to have in place. So the question is, people living with primary immunodeficiency disease are pushing for paid plasma, saying their lives depend on it. Is it true that paid plasma will help Canada's supply of plasma for plasma products like IVIG?
Michelle?
Yeah. Okay. I'll speak to it, and I think Kat will as well. It's an appealing argument if you don't know what's going on, because people with primary immunodeficiency are the people who are most at risk of dying, being seriously ill and dying without one of the most common plasma products called IVIG. It's an immune system drug made from plasma that in large part for most of the world comes from paid plasma made in the US. And you would think that these patients, are right to be worried. That is true. They are right to be worried, but the answer is not to have paid plasma in Canada, because any extra plasma that's collected by a private system in Canada owns that plasma, as Kat has just explained so well. And that plasma then becomes their asset to be sold to the highest bidder on the international markets. So it is not going to help Canadians. What a patient with primary immune deficiency should be concerned about is when a shortage occurs from that global single supplier, the US plasma fractionation industry, what measures can Canada take to protect its own citizens? And the answer is Canada can collect enough of its own plasma that in times of crisis, we as Canadians have ownership of the product and can triage it to the people who need it most, so that the people who receive it are those who would otherwise die, and those who need it but not for life-saving purposes will have to take a back seat. That's not going to happen if a private sector company is collecting the plasma and sending it offshore to the highest bidder.
Kat,
Go
do you
ahead,
have anything to add?
It's just a false flag, right? It's just a continually false flag. So these bills that were passed, they have no impact on the US import, none. all they do is see, the thing is, the difference is that in America, they have a protection there in that country to protect their biologics and their plasma system. They have it there under the presidential orders. We have nothing like that here, which is why these laws are so important. And so this doesn't stop product from the US. I mean, if, you know, the US system has to be overhauled because of where they're sourcing plasma from the most vulnerable populations and communities. There's huge health issues there, and there are massive issues with having a co-opted donor or seller base for your plasma. If you go to our website, bloodwatch.org, right on our homepage, you'll see a very disturbing documentary about how some of the plasma companies literally are getting plasma sold to them from migrants who are coming over from Mexico. So that's incredibly problematic, because you cannot trace those donors if there's a new bloodborne pathogen that emerges. So the issue when it comes to people who have primary immune deficiency, their product right now is secure, because there is CBS has contracts, and they have a secure supply chain with the drugs that are being used in the IgG or an IVIG. The problem right now is not about a current shortage. The problem is about the shortage that will come because of the demand. So in order to mitigate that risk as a country, we need to make sure that we have that secure base, and you can only do that when it's a national resource. The Alberta government has absolutely zero say over a private commercial plasma collector. They're regulated under Health Canada, and they are just letting them essentially collect and sell as much as they want. And that's how they make their money. So the argument that this is going to Canadian patients is completely false. Canadian Blood Services does not have a contract with this company, and it's not going to. If I may, I just want to briefly read a paragraph because Canadian Blood Services testified at the Senate last year on this issue and was very clear with what they were saying. In Canada, a small collection operation or two, meaning the two that exist right now in Saskatchewan and Moncton, can likely coexist with the national blood system. It is the emergence of large-scale commercial for-profit plasma collectors that is and remains a concern. This must be carefully considered and responsibly by both CBS and health system leaders as to consequences and impacts. Most significantly for Canada, ceding control of donated plasma to commercial for-profit businesses does not mitigate the domestic security of supply concern. The vast majority of the world's plasma collection is vertically integrated with the fractionation industry, and it serves a global supply chain and does not ensure domestic security of supply. Even if a commercial collector were under contract to CBS, they could redirect their collected plasma to other buyers at the end of the contract term. They are not bound to keep plasma collected from Canadian donors in Canada, and they are not accountable to governments, health systems, and patients, as we are under a prescribed mandate. And that is why it is so critical that the collection side of our plasma and blood system remains under the national operator, because then we have the control, we have the power, and we can make sure that the patients that you just mentioned are actually served and taken care of, and they don't have to live in fear that that risk will not be mitigated.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you for that. I have some great questions from Kate, and I'm just going to read one of them for now because we have other ones to read as well. She's asked if you see a way to compromise by allowing paid plasma, but introducing different laws or regulations to protect the voluntary system to give patients the best of both worlds.
Well, that's what these laws did. They have the best of both worlds.
Okay.
They already have it.
Michelle here. I would be interested to know what Kate thinks is the good side of the so-called best of the paid plasma world, because there isn't an advantage, as we've said. There is a huge disadvantage to the paid plasma world. I think that's probably an important thing to understand. The payment for plasma is portrayed by the industry and often by the media as a slam dunk. Oh, of course, if we need more plasma, let's just pay. It doesn't work that way. I don't think that there is a so-called compromise. I agree with Kat that the system that we are aiming for now is the right path.
I'd also like to argue that we have been at the table at the highest international level, you know, with the EU commissioners, with the head doctors of the blood services, literally from all over the world. Mm-hmm. And if you look at the European Blood Alliance online, or you look at the WHO, the fact of the matter is that they know that in order to secure a base supply chain, they have to do it through their nationalized system, right? It would be like, and especially during a pandemic, this is not the time. I mean, it's just outrageous that they're trying to capitalize, you know, during a pandemic when we need blood donors more than ever. And we don't know what the second or third wave of this pandemic will bring. So it's critical right now that we secure that supply chain. We have a source supply chain right now. And although we believe that it is not the best one, those patients are being served. It's the fact that we have this 3 to 5 year window to work to this 50% self-sufficiency, and we can't permit the private companies to come in, because that's how they make their money. They're going to make their profit by selling to the highest bidder.
Thank you for that. Actually, this is a question that was mentioned quite a bit during the committee hearings today about how this idea will promote jobs here in Alberta and how this industry will create jobs, which is much needed in our province and across the country. Can any of you speak to that issue and what that would look like, or even if the public system could create jobs? Just thought I'd mention it because it is something that they've been asking us. Go ahead, Dr. Brill.
Yeah, just in a very simplistic way, the issue can be looked at if we want to improve plasma collection. That means we have to have more plasma collection centers. If we do that voluntarily, the same number of jobs will be created as if we do it with paid plasma collection. So we're gaining jobs either way. This notion that somehow the option is jobs or no jobs, again, it's a false premise. There will be jobs involved in the collection of plasma, of more plasma in Canada through the voluntary system, just as much as through the paid system.
Perfect. There's another question from somebody who's always contacts us on our Twitter account, and I don't know if either of you can answer this question, but he asks is why are all the patients group in favor of paid plasma? So
that's a really good question. So they're not. So bloodwatch.org, we represented patients in Ontario here when we had the law passed. And the Ontario Hemophilia Society was not in support of the private paid blood operators here. They're the largest chapter of the Canadian Hemophilia Society in the country. And the British Columbia Hemophilia Society, which represents the people with bleeding disorders in the province of British Columbia and who use plasma products, are not supportive of the private paid plasma industry. So there are definitely some strong voices within the patient community that support private commercial operators. And for some reason, they don't understand that Canadian Blood Services is responsible for getting their product. So even if they want to support the private commercial operators, which is what Big Pharma does, because they co-opt a lot of these patient groups, I've seen it happen in front of me in many circumstances that I've been as an advocate, it still doesn't result in what they hope that it would result in, which is the security of supply. So that statement that all the patient groups and patients believe that this is a really great idea is fundamentally false.
Perfect, thank you, Kat. There's more of a comment than a question, and it talks about how they believe that Bill 204 will not change the public blood system, that it will simply repeal prohibitions on collecting plasma that will be used to create vital therapies for Canadian patients. The same practice exists in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, New Brunswick, and countries like Germany, which again, that countries like Germany, Croatia get thrown around quite a bit around here in these parts of the country. So can you comment on that comment?
Yeah, so it doesn't help Canadian patients. I just can't stress that enough. So the company that has been operating in Saskatoon and in Moncton has only depleted our supply. So they haven't done anything for Canadian patients. And so that in itself is fundamentally not true. I'll use this as an example. In Quebec, Hema-Quebec has its own blood system outside of our broader Canadian Blood Services. And in Quebec, a fractionator that was owned by South Korea opened. And Hema-Quebec is put them under contract, and that fractionator is making a product for Hema-Quebec, for patients there. But Hema-Quebec knew that they didn't have to privatize because it's illegal there to pay people to sell their plasma, and they don't want commercial operators in because they have a very successful plasma collection strategy that they're expanding on. So they know that it actually works in the benefit of not just the government and the budgets to have the power of having the source, and then you can contract fractionate your drug, but that's the safest way to operate, because if something were to happen with the fractionation facility, they can move their contract over and they can get another fractionator to make the plasma drug. The other issue that people don't seem to understand is that companies fold. Companies fold and they shut down, and that has been experienced in Europe. That if some of the paid blood collectors, close up shop, they lose all the access to those donors. They can't get them back in the system, and so there's a security net when you have your national blood operators collecting on your behalf, because it's guaranteed to go to Canadian patients, right? And it's a system that we collectively support. And when it comes to products like these that are so critical to life, that's something that we can't, it's impossible for governments to mitigate the risk. That's what I'm saying. They can't, because they can't interfere with how the blood system is run. So we need to heed the warnings of the top doctors around the world, which are saying we have to secure this as a public strategic resource first. We need to do that first, so you know that your domestic patients are taken care of. Like I said, the US already has that. We don't.
Perfect, thank you. We have quite a few, sorry, Dr. Brill-Edwards, did you want to add something?
No, just to say that the questioner mentions Germany, and the example I gave of the inability to get voluntary donors back to the voluntary system after going to a paid plasma system. That example comes from Germany, where paid plasma was introduced, and then several fractionators folded, and collectors folded, and the voluntary patients that had gone to the paid system did not return. So it demonstrates that there are a lot of myths out there saying that, oh, it's very easy to run a double system of paid and unpaid, or voluntary. It doesn't work that way.
No, it should also be noted that there's only 4 countries in the EU that have permitted the paid plasma collectors in the private commercial collectors. So the story of Germany is they lost 120,000 donors overnight when they folded, and it forced the German Red Cross to then implement some type of payment in only that specific region of Germany. And they limit it, the government regulates it very tightly. So they limit it to 25 euros, whether it's the German Red Cross or whether it's private industry, which the private industry doesn't like because, you know, they can't create even more of a competitive model. And that amount would be equivalent to us getting something like $10 because the quality of life and in Germany is so high. And I mean, I've sat with the heads of the German Red Cross and we've reviewed all of their studies. So that's what happened there. In Austria and the other countries that have permitted these private brokers in, they're not pooling, they're not taking donors out of the domestic system because the donors are crossing the borders from the poorer countries and selling the plasma. So this idea that these countries, right, have just unleashed it and let it open up and everybody rushed to sell their plasma is fundamentally false. And if you go to the European Blood Alliance and you download their huge report that they did in 2014, all of that is well documented, and I'm pretty sure it's been updated now.
Perfect. Thank you, Kat. We have quite a few more questions on our system here, but I have one. This webinar is supposed to go for an hour. We started a little bit late, so maybe we'll go for an extra 10 minutes. Before I allow you to kind of do your closing statements or recommendations for us people here in Alberta, there's one question that I wanted to answer. There's a question that brings back the conversation around or CBS buying blood from these private blood brokers that have set up shop in Saskatchewan and New Brunswick. And so what happens to that blood? For example, the one in Saskatchewan, it says here, once they've collected, what happens to that plasma? What's the role of CBS in that situation, for example, what is happening in Saskatchewan with that blood?
So the plasma that's being collected in Saskatoon has created multiple problems. One, Canadian Blood Services can't open a plasma collection center now in Saskatoon because they have a competitor who's literally paying people, paying donors to sell their plasma, and I think at $400 a month now. And they're now forcing people to give over their social insurance numbers, the company. So now they're earners, and I guess they're going to have to claim that money that they're making off of the company. So it's very bizarre. But CBS has no oversight to that plasma. It is literally just a private product. So they're collecting it, that private company collects it, they're selling it to the German, the fractionator Biotest AG, that's who they have currently have a deal with. They have a supply chain deal, and that gets sold to Biotest AG. And then Biotest AG tries to turn it into whatever drug they want and sell that out on the international market. There's absolutely it has nothing to do with CBS. That's what we're trying to make clear, that this myth that CBS knows it's a trap to try to, that the commercial operators are trying to force this business deal that's never going to happen because they have nothing to sell us. They don't have a plasma drug. We don't buy raw plasma from the private paid plasma industry in the United States. We are buying pharmaceutical drugs that are made from the source plasma that's being collected.
So hence it's more of a business conversation rather than a healthcare conversation that we're unfortunately having to have when we allow blood brokers to enter this area and to benefit from the veins of Albertans, unfortunately. I have another question, and I think this will be our final question for the evening. Just so that you know, if you do have questions outstanding, that we will definitely be answering them and sending you the replies from either of our panelists. Again, this webinar will be up on our Facebook as well as our website. So if you missed something or you want to go back and get some clarification, listen to it again. I don't think this is not one of those topics that you can just listen once and get it all at once, because it is rather complex in nature. But finally, the question that I've had 3 times asked already is, could you speak more about the role of the federal government in private blood collection, and what is it that they can do to stop this from occurring?
I'd like to take that. Basically, the federal government has the authority and I would say the duty, in fact, statutory duty, to protect Canadians from infectious diseases that compromise health. And the duty has been largely ignored over the last multiple years as part of a policy called deregulation that's been in effect for at least 4 decades that I've been able to trace. And it means that although the laws are on the book that would allow the government, through the Minister of Health, to issue legislation that limits collection of blood and plasma to voluntary circumstances for the most part, with exceptions where that's appropriate for the public collector. The minister is not showing any signs over the last, decade roughly, of creating such new legislation. The authority of the health ministers, and I'm speaking now not just of the current minister, Haydu, but going back through to the earliest times when these discussions about payment for plasma took place. The authority derives from the Department of Health Canada Act, and the first element of the statutory duty of the minister under that act is to preserve the health and well-being of Canadians. And to me, that clearly includes preserving the capacity of the Canadian government to secure a sufficient supply of safe blood and plasma products for its citizens. So yes, the federal government has a duty. We could speak as well to the safety issue under the Food and Drugs Act. It is a safety issue. The Health Canada denies that at the moment. We've just gone through the fact that in the face of a new pathogen, an unknown new pathogen, there's a very severe safety issue attached to payment. So definitely the federal government has a duty to protect Canadians in regard to payment for plasma, and at the present, they are failing in that duty.
Sandra, I just see a question on the side screen of, am I allowed to answer? I think it's an important one.
Go ahead.
It says, if CBS can't set up a plasma collection system in Saskatoon, why can the private operator set up a collection system in Calgary when we already have a CBS clinic? And my answer to, it's from Yvonne Schmitz. I hope I said that right. They shouldn't, is what they shouldn't do. You should keep these guys right out of Alberta. It's the worst possible scenario, because what's happened now in Moncton and Saskatoon is that the other provinces have to work harder to get more donors to fulfill the gap from the donors that are there. Because if they're pulling over those qualified donors, we're losing them to the system, right? So right now you're selling your plasma, they're selling their plasma to Germany, right? And then Germany it's being owned by China. It's probably because China is the big new market that's opening up. So a lot of the product is going to be going into the Chinese market. And this is not to begrudge anybody or any citizen anywhere in the world, you know, for medication that they might need. But the argument is we can't do that right now. And we have to be able to protect this as a national resource. So if we are the collectors, as in Canadians, you know, through our public blood operator, then we control the supply chain. It will be more cost efficient. This is already, we've already funded it. So permitting these blood brokers actually undermines our investment that we've already made, and we don't benefit. So what a really big point is that any time you want to repeal a piece of legislation or pass it, we need to look at what would be the benefit of that, even if it may not be a favorable piece of legislation, or maybe it's not so favorable, you know, to people who believe in public health care, or, you know, but we have to look at it and distinguish the value, the added value to patients or a blood user. Right? And we all can become patients and a blood user at any moment in our life. And the answer is nothing. We don't get nothing back. We don't get anything back. And it's deeply unfair to characterize this as a bill that will help patients when it won't. And I just want to sum up here really briefly, because I know that somebody asked about CWD, and Dr. Brill-Edwards mentioned it. Our organization helped to expose that over 21 herds of that were being farmed in Canada that were contaminated with CWD were permitted into the human food chain. And the science that is emerging about CWD prions is not positive. There will be a study released within the next 12 months that's already had interim reports that macaque monkeys tested positive for chronic wasting disease by eating meat, not being, it being induced in the brain. And so we have a rapidly expanding prion disease in North America. And that's just one emerging pathogen. And so in order for us to protect supply and have the kind of oversight that we need to in Canada, we need our public regulator to do that and our public blood operator to do that on our behalf.
Perfect. While you get your thoughts together in terms of a final statement or recommendation, I just wanted to read a little comment from a worker from Nova Scotia that I had the opportunity to meet when we were out there presenting to the Canadian Blood Services. And she indicates that she has personally seen the decrease in the number of whole blood units coming in the door since the opening of the paid plasma collector in Moncton. It is absolutely having a negative effect. Those are donors lost and product that is no longer there for our patients, including those in Alberta who we ship products to from Nova Scotia as part of our national system. And that speaks to something that Kat had mentioned as well, is that our blood collection system is a Canadian blood collection system, and whenever there is a province that negatively impacts that supply chain, then we are in serious trouble and could potentially be in more serious trouble. So again, I want to thank all of you for coming out tonight, for sharing this evening with us. We are hoping that in the next couple of days that people will reach out to the members of the private bills committee and let them know that you support our public system, that you support our public blood system as well, most importantly in this situation, and that that you would like to basically share your opinion with them. If you registered, you'll get a list of all those people that sit on that committee, and definitely share your thoughts with MLA Yao, who it was quite evident today by his description of why he thinks this bill is necessary, could have used sitting on our webinar tonight and learn about some of the issues that were described today. again, we will be writing nonstop until Monday when some stakeholders like bloodwatch.org will be making a presentation at that committee, and we will wait to see what's decided after that, and we'll keep you up to date as to where this bill is at after Monday. But Kat, Dr. Brill-Edwards, if you would like to wrap up this evening.
Go ahead, Kat.
Oh, I just want to say thanks to everybody. We'll do our best on behalf of Canadians and Canadian patients. It's been a really, really long 8 years. It's very disappointing when an issue this serious gets politicized. We are completely a nonpartisan organization, and this bill that was initially passed in Ontario was actually supported unanimously by all parties. And Christine Elliott, who's the health minister now in Ontario, she was the opposition health critic at the time. And she was extremely fair and heeded the warnings from the experts. So it would be one thing if we had the international blood experts around the world going to governments and saying, privatize this so you can sell it all over the world, and then we lose control of our supply. But that is not what's happening. And I think that we really have to put a pause on this right now, at least for the next 3 to 5 years, so we can get to our 50% self-sufficiency rate and make sure those patients are taken care of. And we also need to make it clear to the legislators that in a major pandemic where people can't donate blood just because they might have been exposed to COVID-19, or they're worried about, going to a CBS clinic for whatever reasons, this is not the time right now to be undermining or upending the security of our blood system. And that is fundamentally means the security and the protection of our donors.
Thank you, Kat. Dr. Brill.
Well said, Kat. I fully support the very serious fact that it is a mistake at this time to embark on increasing a paid plasma system that will send plasma offshore to the highest global bidder. What we need right now is to understand that payment for plasma does threaten two essential national health resources. It does threaten the continuing sufficiency of our blood system, and it threatens the efforts we are already underway with to improve our voluntary collection of plasma such that we can protect Canadians during times of shortage and crisis. So I really am very appreciative of Friends of Medicare for putting on the webinar. And I would encourage everyone who has been interested to watch the webinar and ask questions to stay tuned and to keep asking themselves questions and getting answers, and to not let a private foreign-based industry persuade us to give up something that is so important to our own national interest, to our fellow Canadians, a safe and secure supply of blood and plasma. Thanks.
Thank you so much for those thoughts. I think that kind of wraps up something very important, and this is something that is worth fighting for. I know initially in 2017 when we started this, actually it was way before that, in 2016 when we started bringing attention to this issue in Alberta, when Canadian Plasma Resources wanted to set up shop here initially, and we pushed for this bill. We did it in honor of all those people that died during the tainted blood scandal, and we owe it to them to continue our work around protecting our blood system, if anything else. And so thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us tonight. Again, in again, that email that you'll be getting as a follow-up, we'll be sending a link to this webinar. We'll be sending you the contact information for all the members of the Public Standing Committee, as well as MLA Yao. And we would also be sending you a copy of the link to bloodwatch.org, so you can see the awesome work that they have actually been doing for years now. Thank you, Dr. Brill-Edwards, for sharing your expertise as well. She sits on the board of the Canadian Health Coalition that we are very proud members of, Friends of Medicare. And I want to thank most of all you for taking the time to be with us tonight. And hopefully you'll follow through with contacting all those MLAs and share your voice with them, because in a time like this, that's all we have left is our voices and our ability to write and let them know that people are watching, that we're not just sitting on our hands, letting them do whatever it is that they want to do during this pandemic. So thanks again. Goodbye.
Thanks for having us. Thank you.